Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Legatum Institute. I am Ann Applebaum, and I'm the director of our Transitions Forum, which is a program that seeks to compare, contrast, analyze, draw conclusions from different experiences of political and economic, radical political and economic transition around the world. For those of you who haven't been here before, the Legatum Institute itself is a nonpartisan public policy think tank. Its signature product is something called the Prosperity Index. We are interested in having a complex conversation about how to promote prosperity, defined not just as wealth, but also as well-being, as rule of law, in a more holistic and complex way. I'm particularly delighted to be here this evening because this is the paper that we're presenting today and that we're going to talk about in a few minutes is really one of the first that we've done trying to use a genuinely comparative method. So the paper is written by the very brilliant Peter Pomerantsev, who is a well-known journalist and broadcaster writing mostly but not entirely about Russia and the former Soviet Union. But it's based on a trip that a group of us from the Institute took a couple of months ago. Peter and my other colleague on my right, Jeffrey Robertson, who is a very extremely distinguished human rights lawyer, co-founder of the Doughty Street Chambers, and a third member of the group, Jovan Ratkovic, who unfortunately wasn't able to be here, amazingly, in part because he couldn't get a visa. He's Serbian, which tells you something interesting. And he is a former leader of Otpor, the Serbian, the anti-Milosevic sort of protest movement, and later he was in the government of Tadic, one of the Serbian governments which tried to eliminate corruption. In any case, we went there as a group and we did a series of interviews, partly arranged by another colleague here, Georgi Petridze, who is a senior fellow at the Georgian Foundation for Strategic International Studies and is known to some people here as the former Georgian ambassador to London, which he was for a number of years. We met a very wide range of people, both from the former government, from the Saakashvili government, from the Rose Revolution, also from the current government, as well as people from NGOs and human rights groups inside Georgia. And the idea, as Peter will explain, was to look comprehensively at Georgia's, by now rather well-known and famous police reform, which the Georgians attempted to rid their police of corruption in a very dramatic way, as Peter will describe, and to look at both the positive and the negative consequences of that reform, and also at the way in which it was done. The Rose Revolution in Georgia was a revolution. Its leaders thought as revolutionaries. They were trying to make a very dramatic change very quickly, and they used what anybody would describe as revolutionary tactics, and that had upsides and downsides. And it was really that process, that way of thinking about reform and change was one of the things that we wanted to analyze and look at, and to try and describe. Peter's paper is not a strictly academic paper. It's a sort of lucid and, of course, well-written argument about change and how to think about it. And he will we'll start with him giving a few highlights from it. I urge everybody to read it. If you're listening online, to click on it. We have it here. He will make a few remarks about explaining the main thesis. I'm then going to ask Georgi to talk a little bit about what Georgia was like before the reform, and then I will ask Jeffrey Robertson to speak a little bit about some of the downsides. As I think he'll explain, he was involved in a number of court cases in Georgia at the time, and he can explain from his own point of view some of the downsides of what happened. I'm told to tell you that if you're tweeting, the hashtag is Clean Georgia, which could be a I don't know, cleaning product advertisement, but it's not. It's about ending corruption. And our Twitter name is @LegInstitute, which you'll find on your if you start writing out Legatum. Anyway, we will start at 6. We will end promptly at 7:15, 7:30. We will end it promptly. We will end by 7:30. So if you have somewhere else to go, you won't be late. Peter, why don't you begin? Turn off your phone.
Yep.
In the olden days, I would tell all of you to turn off your phones, but now you're probably communicating with lots of people while this is going on, so I won't say that. Just, keep it quiet if you're doing it. Peter will begin with his explanation of the high points of the paper.
Yeah, I think it's worth revisiting very briefly some of the successes that the Georgian reformers managed to achieve. And on the one hand, this has been written about quite a lot, but I think it's just worth revisiting it in order to set up the rest of the discussion. And also, we met some great characters in Georgia, so it's always worth sort of, just looking at their experiences again. And there was one quote that really stood out for me from our trip, from a larger-than-life character in many ways, Kaka Bendukidze, also known as Kaka Banditkidze by some Russian critics. He was a Georgian who made a lot of money in Russia in the 90s, then came back to sort of create a new Georgian economy and became kind of a godfather of the economic reforms there. And he talks very, very well. And out of his many great quotes, there's one that really stood out for me. When we asked him, how do you change a country? How do you go about, starting these revolutionary reforms? And he said, Soviet instruction leaflets for Kalashnikovs describe it as an implement to shoot, hit, or stab with. It's the same with reforms. Use any method you can. If you can't shoot, stab. There is no McKinsey guide to reforms. Theories are meaningless. My main advice, don't write a plan, write aims. You might write down 20 aims, and if you achieve one of them, that's great already. If there are institutions which abuse the system, then just get rid of them. And they had here's one key theme that he kept on coming back. That we refuse to believe that there was some essential Georgian mentality that was prone to corruption. If you change the rules, you change the mentality. So it's a very, very proactive approach. Clearly, not the softly sort of step-by-step analytical approach that you might expect from political reformers. So when the Georgian reformers started their massive task of changing the country, they were kind of faced with a challenge because people had been talking about reforms for years. This wasn't a new thing. The previous government had always talked about reforms. They'd get lots of money from the IMF, they'd get lots of money from the EU. It would all disappear. It's a problem that we know from everywhere. And I met with one of the young people who were kind of faced with that challenge. How do you go from words about reforms to making them a reality? And she was like all these Georgian ministers, she was like 26 or something when she became deputy minister for the interior. And they looked around, they were like, what do we start with? It's all very nice talking about reforms. How do you make them real? And it was very interesting, the language that she used. She was like, we knew that we needed a marketing campaign for reforms. We had to prove to people that they were at all possible. We need to find a mini reform, maybe not a significant reform, but a psychologically important reform that could prove that you could actually change anything in Georgia. And they looked around, they thought, how about the customs? Because customs was a very big deal, huge corruption on the border. Every time you try to get something into Georgia, the customs people would sort of, not let it through until it didn't pass. Until you paid a bribe, And so they tried the customs thing, but they found this huge bureaucratic pushback. The customs guys just wouldn't let anything through. They're like, we're going to reform that. OK, then we're not going to let anything through the border. So they were pushed back straight away. The customs people were very entrenched. They couldn't just sack them all. So they kept on looking around, and they came across one institution, which is actually fairly small, but which they thought they could change, which has now become a legendary reform, which was the patrol police, the traffic police, the traffic cops. And they chose the traffic cops because they could reform them, basically. They were quite small. They were demoralised. Everyone hated them. And there was it was just something they could manage. And so they went forward with, a very, very sort of brave reform where essentially they sacked all of them overnight. For several months, Georgia had no traffic police. The traffic was pretty much the same as always. Just people weren't being stopped for sort of like, for giving out bribes. And then they went on this very, very public campaign to transform the traffic cops. So it was almost like a reality show. They took these sort of famous TV personalities and they would travel around the country, selecting young, bright things who would be the new traffic police. This was put in TV, almost like a pop idol with traffic police. And they had it was very visually based. It was very they wanted the young traffic police to be young. They wanted them to be articulate, to polite. They wanted them to look good. They wanted them to be slimmer. There was a real kind of identification of large bellies, traffic police, bribe taking. And so they really were we had to get slim people in. This is something they keep on referring. We had to look at them. That was one of the huge things as well. We used to be all fat, all plump men. It became 15%, 20% women. These new recruits, they were given a completely new course, a completely new system of training. Instead of a 4-year MA in how to get bribes, it was like a 3-month US sort of specialized course in how to be nice. They were sort of told that they were public servants now. They were given role plays, how not to shout at people, how not to bully them, how to be nice. And all this started to have an effect. Only 60% of people who went through the training will get through. Their salaries went up from $30 a month to $500 a month. So basically, at the end of this, this process was incredibly successful. Traffic police aren't that important, but because it's something that people could recognize visually, it sort of created a climate in which people started to go, hold on, maybe reforms are possible. And after that, they could start pushing through reform of the actual police, reform of the customs service, all these much bigger kind of tasks. So this was something that they thought about very strategically, and it was very important for them to pick something small. And I was in Ukraine recently, and they're like, let's start with traffic police. And I was talking to the reformers, and I was like, not necessarily. You just have to find that one, you have to find that one reform that will give people confidence that you can do more afterwards. Anyway, that's the sunny side of Georgian reforms. I think maybe Jeffrey can now tell you about the sort of less sunny side.
Well, before we get to Jeffrey, I wanted Georgi to say a few words. Again, I mean, there are some in this audience will know. Can you talk a little bit about what was the problem of corruption in Georgia? What did it look like in the 80s and 90s? What was it that the Saakashvili team was trying to overcome?
Well, before I have a go at that, I have to say that when I talk about Georgia, I will not pretend that I'm completely impartial because, first of all, I represented my country as an ambassador to London until last year, and my entire career has been spent in advocating for my country. So I think Mr. Robertson would sympathize with my position. When I talk about Georgia, I speak as a defense attorney, more or less. So all the ills and goods that we have experienced have been quite personal, and they were part of what I did, what I tried to address myself as someone who would try to give outside advice to my government. But yes, Georgia until 2004 was perceived as the corruption source. And there was a popular idea in many countries, particularly in Russia, that all corruption in post-Soviet space originates from Georgia because of the cultural traditions, I don't know, southern lifestyle, whatever. But Georgia was perceived as the very source of whatever was wrong in terms of corruption with Soviet Union at times, and then later, after Soviet Union broke apart. And it was really difficult to believe that these deep-rooted, as many thought, phenomena could have been tackled. And it really took radical measures, such as Peter has described, more or less. Well, on the daily basis, when you would go to your daily activities, first thing that you would have to do would be to navigate your car around potholes and try not to get caught by the traffic police that would ambush you, without any doubt. And it was a big daily, very unpleasant thing. Any public service would come at huge costs for your neural system, and also you had to pay bribes.
For sort of normal public services.
Everyday life was very much would involve paying bribes or taking bribes for some part of the population. Well, there were attempts to address corruption, and period between 95 and 98 can be described as Shevardnadze's kind of positive years. But in early 98, there was a second attempt on his life, and this is when many things stopped, and when corruption basically was tolerated from then on. And this is what turned us more or less into a failed state. By the end of 2003, Georgia was failing as a state, literally. Our budget was a few $100 million, which was never fulfilled. It was sequestered every year, and public services were more or less absent, as I said. And one of the reasons why Shevardnadze didn't really fight the Rose Revolution was that nobody would stand on his side. It was more peaceful exactly because the government, the state by then was largely dysfunctional. The second greatest problem was that the country was more or less ruled by the organized crime. And this is something, another great thing that basically is the legacy of the previous government of those 9 years. So it was
the Rose Revolution government.
Yes, that not only people, for new generation that grew up during that period, many essential things that were a reality for us, they are not even aware of this. For instance, my generation grew up knowing that mafia bosses were very respectable people. And this idea would be completely ridiculous for the generation of my children, or even older people. So it's gone, completely gone. It would be very difficult for any future governments in Georgia to make people comfortable with the old ways. People now are accustomed, and they will protest very strongly if they encounter corruption by the civil service, by the police, or the idea of crime returning as a normalcy. I doubt it will be possible. So there is a real legacy that government left with all the shortcuts they used and many too tough measures and sometimes illegal measures. But the country, when you compare to what we were in 2004, was transformed in the 9 years.
So beginning with the right. So Peter. So beginning with the traffic police.
Yeah, traffic police just was obviously yes. What's interesting about traffic police is that it then gave the reformers the confidence, gave the public the confidence they could do much bigger reforms. I mean, I don't think anybody would say the traffic police is that important compared to sort of much bigger issues. But what was interesting for me was the way they talked about it. It's that we needed a marketing project just to make people believe that reforms are possible.
And then from there, they proceeded to tackle corruption in other ways.
Yeah, but then they went on to the proper police, which is a much bigger challenge, and they only got so far through it. Then the customs, then all these other sort of large institutions. At the same time, they were trying economic reform to make business simpler. But it was like psychological moment. You need that first little thing. We see that in Ukraine now. That sense of we really want to reform, but what do we start with? What can we really do? We can't touch this. We can't touch that. So there was wisdom in their approach, I think.
Jeffrey, you were dealt personally with. You had a number of cases in Georgia during that period, during the Saakashvili period. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the cases and what you saw as the negative.
Well, I think it's always a real problem for revolutionaries, whether from the left or the right, usually the left, but not in this case, what to do about the judiciary. You see that in Egypt today, where a judiciary that had, in effect, destroyed the Brotherhood is now sentencing exactly as the army wants any connection with the Brotherhood.
And I should say, this is what Jeffrey's been dealing with all day. He's now taking a brief break.
But this is, you know, my sense of what this revolution is, as a foreigner on the ground, is that it was really a youth revolution. And I think, picking up what you said, I mean, all the officials, all the politicians were under 30. Reminded me of that yippie phrase of the 60s, never trust anyone over 30. Because they were all in their 20s, and they were idealistic. They'd done their first degree maybe in Moscow, but their second degree at Harvard. And they did wonderful things to begin with, because they did inherit or take over an entirely non-workable criminal society in which crime and corruption had infiltrated at every level. And they did remarkable things with the police. But of course, they came up against the problem of the revolutionary, what to do about the judges who are twice your age and the judges who are, many of them had corrupt links with the old regime, and they prosecuted a number of them. But as judges do, particularly in ex-Soviet states, you've got to understand the Soviet training of the career judge. It goes back, there's a remarkable book which they all learnt in Moscow, the Framework of Justice in the USSR, in which it was said, spelt out, that the judge has to be a political worker. The real art of just Soviet justice is actually to interpret what the government wants. It's often telephone justice. You get it on the telephone. But that book was written by none other than Andrei Vyshinsky, who was, of course, the prosecutor of Stalin's show trials. And the mentality of the Soviet-trained judge is to be a political worker. And the judges, for the most part, after the Rose Revolution, some of them, as I say, were prosecuted for abuse of office. And that's a problem in itself, because this all-purpose crime, this dragnet crime of abuse of office, is a gift to the Soviet-style prosecutors. It gives them their power. It was used against Yulia Tymoshenko. It can easily be fabricated. But anyway, a number of them were removed. The rest took fright and fell into line. And this was very tempting to the revolutionaries. Judges who, frightened by the prosecutors, do what you want. And so the conviction rate in Georgia courts was 98.6%. 98, the Georgian prosecutors are never wrong, or only wrong in 1.4% of the cases. This also, in fact, in Ukraine, there's the same 99%, in effect, conviction rate, and most of the cases being done under plea bargaining rules. And any judge who steps out of line gets prosecuted for abuse of office. So in a way, the revolutionaries who began so well with the police suddenly found that they were tempted and they fell. They had a compliant judiciary, and this is enormously corrupting. And they were corrupted. In the cases that I did in the World Bank Court, we found that extraordinary. They would suborn witnesses on the other side. They would play tricks. They wouldn't lose. There was a famous case, Ronnie Fuchs's case. He was an Israeli businessman whose property was expropriated, and the World Bank Court ordered the Georgians to pay $100 million. Well, they weren't going to pay anything if they could avoid it. And what they did, they set up an extraordinary sting operation in which they said, the only way we're going to pay you what the World Bank Court has ordered, and which we're bound to pay, but the only way we're going to pay is if you come to a special celebration in Georgia, say that Kiss and Make Up, we're going to have a banquet, and we'll give you your money, hand over the check on television. Well, this was an invitation delivered by the Prime Minister, personally. Of course, against the advice of his lawyers, Ronnie went to Batumi. The feast was all laid out, television cameras, everything. And of course, he was tapped on the shoulder, taken upstairs, arrested, and tried for corruption and jailed for 8 years. It's a long story. He eventually got out after a year of being beaten up in prison and got 37 million of his 100 million. But that was the kind of mentality that I think in the end, after a few years, got into the pure revolutionaries. They couldn't resist the power of directing the judiciary, the power of having a judiciary that was there to intuit what the politicians wanted. So I think that was one reason when we went round and talked to people, they did tell us stories of the way in which the government became, after its great start, became very arrogant, fell for a rule of law in which they ruled, and the law fell by the wayside. So what do you do? And I think this is, it's a very difficult issue, and every revolutionary government will face it. What do you do with the judiciary? Do you begin again? Do you sack them all and bring in new judges from private law? That's worked in a number of cases, because the temptation in many countries is to simply recruit judges from the government sectors, from the prosecution, from the and so forth. Or do you have a system in which judges are held accountable? I think this is the way we are moving, or at least the way we would seems to work best, to have a judicial code of conduct, to have a public complaint system, to have an independent body that investigates and can weed out the bad judges, but at the same time can imbue, and it takes some time, imbue the judicial system with a sense of the importance of their own independence. Every human rights treaty guarantees an independent and impartial judiciary. We know what partiality is, it's bias, and there are many examples of that. But what independence more crucially is independence from influence by government, by army, by private repositories of power. So I think the Rose Revolution, and where it ultimately failed, and it failed in the eyes of the informed public, was in changing the judiciary and in imbuing them with some sense of their own independence, the idea that they could acquit without being prosecuted for abuse of office, the idea that they could rule against the government, the development of a public law system, which is perhaps the most important way in which the rule of law can be conducted independently.
Peter, is that would you say that's an accurate reflection of what you heard? And, you know, one of the things we talked about there was there some way in which, you know, the sort of revolutionary thinking, which was so successful in some ways, was there some ways in which, at what point did the line of thinking go wrong? Where was the mistake made? Was it to do with the framework? Was it to do with the tactics? What did you conclude?
Well, it was very interesting because it's such a pity Jovan Ratkovic, our Serbian colleague, isn't here, because they felt they had the same problem after they got rid of Milosevic in Serbia. It's a chicken and egg. You're in a corrupt society. To kill the corruption in society, you have to be quite, zero tolerance and very strong. For that, you need a judiciary that follows what you say, because if you don't change the judiciary, they're all being corrupted. So it's a real problem even for the for the most kind of like progressive revolutionaries. But it was very interesting in Georgia when we started unraveling the question, where did this come from? I ended up going back not to 2004, not even to 1991, but all the way back to sort of to the 50s and 60s, to the beginnings of the democratic strivings in Georgian society. Because right from the very beginning, Georgian dissidents, they talked a lot about democracy, but what they were talking about were not human rights, they're talking about national rights. So the earliest sort of Georgian dissident movement was, I can't remember which year it was, but it's the year when Khrushchev got rid of Stalin. A young Gamsa Khurdias formed something called the Society of King Vakhtang. This was one of the first Georgian dissident societies. Gorgi might correct me, but I'm doing my best. 56. 56, of course. And this was to defend Stalin from that nasty Khrushchev who'd got rid of the good Georgian. Even though they hated Stalin as a dictator, the fact that one of our guys was thrown out by this, you know, this Slavic bumpkin. Yeah.
He died, actually.
You know, right? It was Beria, actually. It was after Beria. It was after Beria.
He was thrown out of the mausoleum.
Yes, more out of, but also they got rid of Beria. That was a huge push as well. But it was seen as an anti-Georgian thing. And so throughout the sort of Georgian dissident movement of the 1970s and 1980s, if you look closely at it, what they're talking about is national independence. What they're talking about is security from Russia. They're not actually... Human rights comes third or fourth in that list. And when Saakashvili comes to power, even though when he talked to the West, he would talk about, I want to be like the EU, within his circle, they would talk more about Singapore. They would talk more about Ataturk. They would talk about creating a strong state. They weren't talking about human rights. So really, when you get to that stage much later on, where the judiciary is, trying to make the state strong rather than make the state good, this was really embedded in the original motivations for Georgian reforms going all the way back. So I think that's something that we discovered in the process, that it's that original question behind the question, the motivations for reforms, very important. Is your motivation just to have a sort of a spiky state, or is it to have, a benevolence, a social justice part of your initial mission? And it was only secondary for them right from the start.
Well, can I address that? I think there is a reason for that. I wouldn't go into the Soviet times, but during Shevardnadze, and especially when Saakashvili came to power, there was an existential threat to the very existence of the Georgian state. We had experienced 2 wars already by then with Russia through proxies and sometimes with Russian direct military involvement, which resulted in ethnic cleansings of Georgians both in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Second, we had Russian military bases all around the place, but particularly in these 2 regions where Russian tanks had their engines running, and we still have exactly the same situation. Russian tanks are within 45 kilometers from the capital of Tbilisi, of Georgia. So you wouldn't necessarily ignore that fact, and that was the most tangible reality that I think puts it in context. Not that the human rights weren't very dear to the hearts of those revolutionaries. And I also would like to mention something to also put the Ronnie Fuchs story in context, because the way my government handled it not only illustrates how much they were prepared to ignore the rule of law at some points, but it also illustrates what they inherited, because the Ronnie Fuchs story starts in the Shevardnadze times, when certain Mr. Fuchs signed a contract with some government official, which then Shevardnadze government tried to investigate and never found any authorization for that deal. But the deal was, believe it or not, for Mr. Fuchs's 100% control of any energy transits through Georgia in the future. And guess what? Very soon after this, Baku-Supsa happened, then Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan happened, and then Baku-Tbilisi-Erzurum gas pipeline happened, and Mr. Fuchs said, pay me or cut off the pipelines. That's the simplified version.
He did win the case in the World Bank court.
Yes, but
we're going to reopen it now.
But what I'm saying is,
what
I'm saying is that the 90s in Georgia was like this. someone from nobody, without any investment, could have signed a deal by which Georgian government to commit to something like this. All right, so this is just the context for this story. So yes, I would maintain one thing, that we need to judge by the results. And I'm not sure whether all those countries who are now in dire need for the reforms would necessarily be very enthusiastic about the following Georgian reforms, because the story goes like this. Okay, you have inherited a broken country, a failed state, and after 9 years, you will leave it with GDP that is almost twice as larger than it was when you came to power. The GDP per capita, everything has improved. There is a relative law and order. There is one of the lowest crime rate, by the way, in Europe.
Walking around Tbilisi in the early hours of the morning is
many other
utterly
things.
safe.
For some reason, many members of our team liked to go for walks at 2 a.m. They all came back and reported it was very safe.
But
That's what we're
No,
testing
that
out.
was because of the 4-hour time difference. You get it at midnight.
But the people that benefited from all this will vote you out.
Yes.
And some of you will go to jail. So there's a dilemma.
But why did they vote you out? This is the problem. This is the issue.
Because
They voted you out.
democracies, Mr. Robertson, as you would know, people get tired of the governments, even if government is much better than the UNM government was.
They told us that they voted you out because they couldn't get justice, because they were arrested and they had no habeas corpus, because they had no chance in front of the judiciary that was really lickspittle in relation to the government. And that was one of the issues. I mean, we spoke to, of course, the new Justice Minister,
Yes.
who was very eloquent on this subject, as you would expect. But also we spoke to the the guy who'd been Attorney General for a year in the new government and had resigned and was very independent. And he made the same point, that you just hadn't
the current
delivered
government
justice.
obviously would make that point.
But can we take it to? So this is, but you. I think Peter, pointing to the chicken and egg dilemma you had, and you make an interesting point, which is extremely relevant right now for other post-Soviet states, and particularly to Ukraine, which is a country which is very eager to make a breakthrough, to make some radical reforms right away, and it also happens to be under enormous amount of security pressure and literally military pressure from Russia. Can you draw lessons from this? Sure. Is there as a how would you take this further?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that we're talking about, at least when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about Ukraine now, because this is, as we all know, a lot of the Georgian reformers are now almost being advisors to the new Ukrainian government, and this is kind of the context that I'm thinking about this in, rather than good Saakashvili, bad Saakashvili. I think history will tell whether it was good or bad. But there was one factor we haven't discussed yet, because and something that comes up in conversation a lot when I talk to people in Ukraine, and that's the role of sort of the Western powers or international bodies. So something very odd happened in the relationship between sort of the West and Georgia, in that even though on a kind of low level, if you go through the weeds, the EU and the World Bank, well, not the World Bank, the EU certainly, and the UN and a lot of international NGOs would be quite critical of some of the sins of the Saakashvili era. Officially, there was always kind of almost blind support on the kind of like big level.
George Bush level.
Yeah, on the George Bush level, and also on the kind of, the few levers that the West had sort of level. Very important to get this, sort of remedy this mistake in Ukraine. So what should have been happening in Georgia is the West should have been talking not just to the government, but to the few very, very good, objective, critical NGOs, and listening to them more, and then kind of squeezing the government a little bit with funding. I mean, by not giving the next bit of billion-dollar aid. In Ukraine, we have a unique situation where we have, I think, pretty much the European champions in terrible governance. Maybe the world, I don't know. But definitely European champions in terrible governance. It's not improving, but a very, very mature, motivated, muscly kind of civil society, which is just won on Maidan and which is now sort of ready almost to take power, but it's just not getting into government. So what we have to do, because this is the only thing that I can think of, is sort of a sort of pincer movement between Western funders and a strong civil society in Ukraine, where they squeeze the new government. That's happening informally. So there's people in the EU phoning literally people in civil society saying, should we give $1 billion to this minister? And they're like, no, he's awful. But this has to become institutionalized with media support and so on and so forth. That's something that was really missed in Georgia. And I think that's something that we can learn from. There's a huge role to play. When billions are being given to these governments, there's a huge leverage that the West has.
There's another thing that became very clear to me in Georgia in the few days that I spent there, was the degree to which, I don't want to say the West misled Georgia, because it's not quite right. I mean, but there were implicit promises made, and there was a way in which the Georgian reformers would say, they would have checklists, we need to do this, this, and this, and this, and if we do all this, we get into the West, we get into the EU, we get into NATO, we get to, then somebody will come and protect us, they'll, I don't know, if they imagined, F-16 swooping down over Ossetia, but, the idea was that, some of their motivation, you're right, was to change things as fast as possible. Some of it was to do things in such a way that the EU and NATO would find it acceptable. And some of that, it's slowed down a little bit, but some of that still goes on now. What worried me about that was, so on the one hand, there was a similar pattern in Central Europe in the 90s, where the Slovaks and the Poles and others said, all right, we need to go through this checklist, and then at the end of that, we're going to get into the EU. And so, okay, we need to do this, this, and this, and we need to change this about our armies, and we need to reform some institutions, and whether or not they really thought it was a good idea or they thought much about it at all, they just did it. And there's some of that, you hear some of that language and motivation in Georgia. What worries me is what will happen when, at the end of the day, inevitably the EU says, well, we'll sign an association agreement with you, but you're not going to be a member of the EU. And when NATO says, we'll do a partnership agreement with you, but you aren't going to be in NATO. And I personally don't see any imminent sign that NATO is going to extend its security guarantee to Georgia, much as I'm saying that as a fact rather than a desire. I'm sorry about that, but that is the case. And what worries me is that how that will affect the domestic reform process inside Georgia. Is that, will people then stop? They'll say democracy was a waste of time. It didn't get us where we wanted to go. Economic reforms weren't efficient. I don't know the answer to that. There are clearly other motivations for reform, and there are other, ways in which, other reasons why things happen in Georgia. But there has been, over the past decade, a very important element of, we are doing some of these things in order to meet an outside requirement. And when the goal at the end is taken away, as I fear it will be, I worry that there could be backpedaling, or there could be questioning of whether the whole process was worth it. That's my concern. I don't know if you share that. Why don't you answer that, and then we can open up. I know there are a lot of people who will have views on all these subjects.
I would say, as a citizen who has benefited from whatever progress Georgia and previous governments have achieved, not just only one, but all of those that were before, that if by trying to become members of the European Union and NATO, we implement a number of reforms, and at the end of the process we actually do not become members of these organizations, well, my country and I personally will still benefit a lot by becoming a better place to live, to start with. So I would be perfectly happy if we had met all the criteria of the EU membership, but even if we didn't join, of course I would be sorry personally, but Georgia would be a much better place. And from what I've heard from politicians, I'm not one of them, was that this process of reforms was by itself a goal. Of course, they all try to make it complementary on our path to joining these two organizations, but this is not viewed as the end by itself. We were never fixed just by the membership in the EU, which would give us free money and we would immediately become a rich country. If someone has illusion like that, I'm sorry. But this is an illusion. And as for the NATO security guarantee, yes, Georgia has been contributing actually more to NATO operations in the course of many years now than many actual member states. And it would be only fair that once Georgia meets all the requirements and criteria, Georgia should be given the membership. But if that doesn't happen, well, yes, it would be a huge problem, and Georgia will have to seek for some alternative security umbrella. But again, the whole idea of joining NATO and the European Union was not just to protect ourselves from a very hyperactive and aggressive bully neighbor. The choice for us was based on, well, you call Georgians what you like, but the European values to us are closer than the values of whatever union is now forming to the north from us. Because if you look at the criteria of these unions, I mean, and the neighborhood policies of these unions, you can compare the Eastern neighborhood policy of the European Union. Well, the idea is to enable the Eastern neighbors to become more stable and prosperous democracies. Well, Russia has the neighborhood policy as well for us, and the idea is exactly the opposite, to make us destabilized, poor and failed states, which would enable Russia to control us easier. So, excuse me, I think the choice for that is very clear. And yes, it would be a pity if we do not eventually join these organizations, but the process that is as a roadmap for the membership coincides with the course for reforms that is necessary to transform our country into a better place. And I'll be fine with that.
I hope that's a widespread view. Not entirely certain of it.
But can I ask a question?
And then I want to open it up.
What if the Kremlin were to say, and would say this very loudly and clearly through all its various allies in Georgia, including the Patriarch with 94% of popularity, would say, we give you back Abkhazia, we give you back South Ossetia, don't join NATO. And they say, have a referendum on that. And they kick in some very good energy deal. Same time, Merkel says even louder, you're not getting into NATO. Well, but could you just imagine that theoretically, though?
Well, you know, diplomats normally do not discuss hypothetical things. Second,
I'm just throwing it out.
Second of all, it is completely impossible. Abkhazia and South Ossetia is not Russia's to give, and it will last under their control as long as Russia manages to be on course, and this is not a sustainable course in my view.
Thank you very much, and I believe you're all invited for a drink downstairs. So thank you.